and then take a few of your questions on that subject. I think the President did a fairly thorough job in terms of describing the new military approach, and I think the important point in that is a conditions-based approach as opposed to a time-based approach that had specified troop ceiling levels and timetables. And I think the President's been quite clear that what will be different this time is he has empowered our military commanders on the ground to make more timely decisions, to conduct battlefield operations based upon the conditions on the ground with the battle plans that Secretary of Defense Mattis will be approving. That is going to change the dynamic on the ground considerably. These are some of the same tactics that have been employed in the very successful campaign to defeat ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And so I think we're taking a lot of lessons learned from our success there, and we'll translate those to Afghanistan. This is going to take some time for our military to go through a new set of training with some of the Afghan forces. The fighting will still be borne by the Afghan forces, by their military and their security forces. But we believe that we can turn the tide of what has been a losing battle over the last year and a half or so, and at least stabilize the situation and hopefully start seeing some battlefield victories on the part of the Afghan forces, who have fought very bravely, but they've been fighting, I think, with less than full capabilities that we can give them. I think similarly on the diplomatic front, we too are going to adopt a conditions-based diplomacy. We're going to condition our efforts along with the progress we see being made by the Afghan government, who must continue the reform efforts that we've been working on for some time, in particular, much more rigorous efforts around the anti-corruption. Now, part of the corruption challenge in some respects has been the methods and ways in which we have been delivering some of our aid. We've not been as accountable, I think, to ourselves in terms of ensuring that our aid programs, development programs, are delivering the results that they were intended to deliver. Some of that has been challenged by the security environment. It's very difficult for many of our aid workers to operate in Afghanistan. So as the security environment improves, we expect to adopt a different approach as to how we deliver on the development and assistance that supports the Afghan government in their reforms as well. I think the President was clear this entire effort is intended to put pressure on the Taliban, to have the Taliban understand you will not win a battlefield victory. We may not win one, but neither will you. And so at some point, we have to come to the negotiating table and find a way to bring this to an end. Now, this is a regional approach, and part of why this effort took as long as it did is we chose not to just focus on Afghanistan, but we undertook a fairly comprehensive review of our relationships in Pakistan and our relationship with India. And we see this approach as requiring an integration of all three of those strategies, and use Pakistan, India to also bring pressure to bear on the situation in Afghanistan. Pakistan in particular can play an important role here, certainly in delivering the Taliban to the negotiating table. Pakistan has suffered acts of terrorism. Their citizens have suffered acts of terrorism as dramatic as any we've seen anywhere. And we stand ready to help Pakistan address terrorist organizations inside of their country, but they must adopt a different approach themselves. Pakistan and the U.S. historically had very good relationships, but over the last few years there's been a real erosion in the confidence between our two governments. There's been an erosion in trust because we have witnessed terrorist organizations being given safe haven inside of Pakistan to plan and carry out attacks against U.S. servicemen, U.S. officials, disrupting peace efforts inside of Afghanistan. Pakistan must adopt a different approach, and we are ready to work with them to help them protect themselves against these terrorist organizations, but certainly to begin to end their attacks that are disrupting our efforts at peace. We are going to be conditioning our support for Pakistan and our relationship with them on them delivering results in this area. We want to work with Pakistan in a positive way, but they must change their approach. India is emerging as a very important regional strategic partner with the United States and has played an important role supporting the Afghan government and in particular supporting their economy. India's provided developmental assistance. They've provided economic assistance. They are hosting an important economic conference in India this next week. All of that is important to stabilizing Afghanistan as a nation, get their economy functioning, stabilize the country so that they can provide more opportunities to their citizens. These are all elements of what will lead to stability and ultimately a peace agreement. But the effort is, again, a regional effort. Put pressure on the parties to understand that this fighting is going to take everyone nowhere. And it's time to begin a process. It may very well be a lengthy process of reconciliation and a peace accord. And Afghanistan, as the President said, can choose its form of government that best suits the needs of its people, as long as it rejects terrorism, never provides territory in Afghanistan to provide safe haven for terrorists, and accommodates all of the groups represented inside of Afghanistan, ethnic groups and others. How they want to organize themselves is up to them. But we have to recognize that their culture is a tribal culture, and their history accommodates the nature of those relationships. There's no reason their form of government cannot accommodate that as well. So we want to facilitate a reconciliation peace process, and we will facilitate them coming to some conclusion around how they want to govern themselves. That's really the essence of the strategy. And before taking your questions, I do want to make one comment on North Korea. I think it is worth noting that we have had no missile launches or provocative acts on the part of North Korea since the unanimous adoption of the UN Security Council resolution. And I want to take note of that. I want to acknowledge it. I am pleased to see that the regime in Pyongyang has certainly demonstrated some level of restraint that we've not seen in the past. We hope that this is the beginning of this signal that we've been looking for, that they are ready to restrain their level of tensions, they're ready to restrain their provocative acts, and that perhaps we are seeing our pathway to sometime in the near future having some dialogue. We need to see more on their part, but I want to acknowledge the steps they've taken thus far. I think it's important to take note of that. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
I'll call out on some of the reporters here. Please keep your questions tight. We don't have that much time today. Natalie from the AP will start with you.
Thanks. I'll be really brief. It seems like, to me at least, that with the no nation building concept that the President laid out last night and what you just said, that the main difference, other than the timetable part of the military stuff, the main difference between this new approach and the old one is that you're eliminating 2/3 of what used to be known as the clear, hold, and build strategy. In other words, we clear, or you clear, you hold, and we won't build, you will. So if that's correct, what happens to the anti-corruption efforts that you mentioned, the good governance, the counter-narcotics, the education programs? What happens to those? And more specifically, what's that going to mean for particularly Afghan women and girls who have been assured for the last 16 years by two separate administrations that they wouldn't be abandoned?
Well, I don't want to suggest that there's that dramatic a difference in terms of our expectations for Afghan government performance. And as you point out, there's been enormous strides achieved in Afghanistan, both in terms of the numbers of millions of children that are now in schools being educated. The role of women in the Afghan economy now has been dramatically changed. I don't expect any of that to be rolled back. I think that has become part of the Afghan government structure. It's become part of what the Afghan people themselves, I think, expect. If you go back many years ago, prior to all of this disruption, that was Afghanistan. That was the nature of Afghanistan 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think it is part of their culture already. We want to support that. In terms of the clear and hold, that is still the approach, is that areas will be cleared and Afghan security forces can hold those areas, thereby enabling some growth in the Afghan economy. Part of what Afghanistan struggles under is they do not have control over but a portion of their economy. So as the forces are able to either hold areas and stabilize them, certainly not give up further ground, and they're still losing ground today, as you well know. So this is going to take a little while. But is to stabilize and then hopefully begin to regain control. And as ground is gained, it will be held by Afghan security forces, while allowing the Afghan government to continue what it has been very successfully doing under our assistance now for many years and not roll back any of those gains that have been made. I don't think that's the aspiration of the Afghan government or the Afghan people either. So we're going to continue to help them institutionally. We may be taking different approaches and not putting so much of the U.S. taxpayer dollar on the ground, building schools and building infrastructures. We think there are plenty of others that we're going to call upon for assistance as well. Rather, we're there to facilitate and ensure that there is a pathway for reconciliation and peace talks as this pressure begins to take hold. And we believe, we already know there are certain moderate elements of the Taliban who we think are going to be ready and want to help develop a way forward. How long that will take will be, again, based on conditions on the ground.
Right. Andrew Mitchell, NBC.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, a question that embraces both the military side and the diplomatic side. On the military side, won't the new rules of engagement mean that in the short term, at least, our forces will be more at risk because they will be potentially doing night raids against the Taliban again, not just training, but actually supporting in a more active role because the Afghan troops are not all up to par here to push back against the Taliban advance. And on the diplomatic side, why didn't the president mention Russia's rearming of the Taliban, which General Nicholson has been talking about very openly? He seemed to be letting Russia off the hook in his speech. And do you have enough people, given the fact that there are not Trump-confirmed diplomatic appointees in many of these positions in the region?
Well, on the military operations side of it, I would really defer to the Department of Defense to answer that one, other than I know the approach is going to be, as I said, similar to what we have had success elsewhere. As Secretary Mattis describes it, it's a by, with, and through approach. And I think that's part of why the need for a step up in troop levels is so we can now at the battalion level organize and help the Afghan army fight in a different way with close ground advisement at the battalion level and the ability to call in support on a more timely basis as needed to ensure victory as opposed to either stalemate or defeat. With respect to the comment about Russia, to the extent Russia is supplying arms to the Taliban, that is a violation, obviously, of international norms, and it's a violation of UN Security Council norms. We certainly would object to that and call Russia's attention to that. If anyone's going to supply arms, it needs to be through the Afghan government. In terms of our footprint on the ground, we have very competent, capable, experienced people there now. Our Afghan ambassador is remaining on the job at this time. We have a Pakistan ambassador that's been nominated. We hope to have that person cleared through the process soon. And even in the transition in Afghanistan, as Ambassador Hale transitions out, we've nominated Ambassador Bass, very experienced diplomat, been running the embassy in Ankara, Turkey, very complex place. He's very well equipped to step into this situation as well. And we are looking at a couple of different people for the Special Representative to Afghanistan, Pakistan position. It's open currently. It's being filled with a very experienced individual today. So we're ready to get going with very competent people we have, and I'm not at all concerned about the competency level or the experience of the people that we have working on this. I'm quite confident with them.
And India?
This next question, Martha Raddatz from ABC. Excuse me.
Sorry, Secretary Tillerson, I know you don't want to talk about the military, but you were just using some military terms and battalion level and that. I know and understand why the administration does not want to talk about tactical moves, but strategy. Don't the American people deserve to know approximately how many more of their sons and daughters will be going back to Afghanistan in a war that's lasted nearly 16 years?
Well, I think, and I don't want to speak for Secretary Mattis, but I think the intent is there will be visibility to troop levels once the decision has been made. I think what the President has conveyed, and I agree wholeheartedly with him, is that we are not going to signal ahead what our plans are. We're not going to signal ahead an increase, a decrease, the timing of any of that. It will be driven by conditions on the ground. The only way we can defeat an enemy that is as nimble and as cagey tactically as this enemy is we have to be as cagey and tactical as they are. And we've not been fighting that way.
Could that include strikes in Pakistan?
I'm not going to comment on what it could include, but the President's been clear that we are going to protect American troops and servicemen. We are going to attack terrorists wherever they live, and we have put people on notice that if you are harboring and providing safe haven to terrorists, be warned, be forewarned. And we're going to engage with those who are providing safe haven and ask them to change what they're doing and help us help them. Because in my view, the greatest benefactor, other than the Afghan people themselves, to achieving stability and peace in Afghanistan are the people of Pakistan. They will benefit more than any other nation.
Margaret Brennan, CBS.
Mr. Secretary, in the back here. You said no preconditions to talks. Specifically, are you saying that the U.S. no longer expects the Taliban to accept the Afghan constitution and specifically the rights of women? And on Pakistan, did you articulate in specific terms, or do you plan to Pakistan the consequences of their actions, whether it be sanctions, dropping their non-NATO ally status? I mean, what exactly have you communicated or do you plan to communicate?
Well, I had a good call with the Prime Minister of Pakistan yesterday afternoon to give them a bit of a forewarning of what they were going to hear in the President's speech. And also, we did touch on the points I've made to you today. We are going to be engaging with them in a very serious and thorough way as to our expectations and the conditions that go with that. And all of those things you just listed are on the table for discussion if, in fact, they are unwilling to change their posture or change their approach to how they're dealing with the numerous terrorist organizations that find safe haven inside of Pakistan. Again, it is in Pakistan's interest to take those actions. When we say no preconditions on the talks, I think what we are saying is, look, the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban representatives need to sit down and sort this out. It's not for the U.S. to tell them it must be this particular model, it must be under these conditions. And I think that's what the President means when he says we're no longer nation building. Look, we've tried taking certain principles and forms around the world, and sometimes it works, and a lot of places it doesn't work. We don't know what's going to emerge here. We're going to be there, obviously, to encourage others, but it's going to be up to the Afghan government and the representatives of the Taliban to work through a reconciliation process of what will serve their needs and achieve the American people's objectives, which is security. No safe haven for terrorists to operate anywhere in Afghanistan now or in the future.
Tom Rogan with the Washington Examiner.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the force protection concerns and Ambassador Bass shortly going to Afghanistan and the SRAP discussions. But how are you going to get someone who is able to go out beyond the wire and negotiate functionally, regularly, in that weekly basis with individuals from the Haqqani network and that force protection concern?
Well, we are going to have to improve the security environment. It is not, the environment today is not conducive to carrying out those types of activities. You're exactly right. And so part of what we're going to have to do is first ensure we're ready to engage when conditions permit us to engage. It again is why Pakistan is very important in this discussion as well. Pakistan can facilitate much of that discussion. And there are other regional players to which this particular conflict and this unstable situation in Afghanistan are important. We've had discussions with the Chinese about a role they might be able to play. We've had discussions with the Russians about the role they could play if they choose to. And certainly regional players in the Gulf, GCC member countries, are very interested in seeing this area in Afghanistan stabilized as well. So there are a lot of partners out here on the periphery that I think will have, from time to time, important roles they can play. Ultimately, it comes down to the two parties, the Afghan government and the Taliban representatives.
Felicia Swartz with the Wall Street Journal.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Going back to Pakistan, officials for quite some time, Democratic and Republican administrations, have tried to get the government to stop giving safe haven to the Haqqani network terrorist groups. What leverage do you think you have?
Well, I think it's obviously we have some leverage that's been discussed in terms of the amount of aid and military assistance we give them, their status as a non-NATO alliance partner. All of that can be put on the table. But, you know, at the end of the day, Pakistan has to decide what is in Pakistan's best long-term interest from a security standpoint for themselves and for their people. Quite frankly, as I evaluate Pakistan's current situation, if I were the Pakistan government, I would have growing concerns about the strength of the Taliban and other organizations inside of Pakistan who seem to be growing their numbers and their presence to the point that at some point they become a real threat to the stability of the Pakistani government itself. I think they need to be thinking about what is in their best long-term interest and how can we work with them to achieve a safer, more stable Pakistan in the next decades to come as well. I think it really is up to them. They've got to ask themselves that question. Why does this work for them, and why is this going to continue to support their stability and the survival of their government in the years ahead if they continue to allow these elements to just grow and maintain their presence inside of Pakistan?
Last question. Welcome, AFP.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Don't you fear on the other side that too much pressure, too tough pressure on Pakistan may destabilize Islamabad and may have destabilizing all the region with having Taliban stronger in the country?
That is a concern, and that's why I made the comments I just made, that I think it's important that Pakistan begin to think about its ability to contain these groups as well. It's why, though, we take a regional approach. The U.S. alone is not going to change this dynamic with Pakistan. India and Pakistan, they have their own issues that they have to continue to work through. But I think there are areas where perhaps even India can take some steps of reapproachment on issues with Pakistan to improve the stability within Pakistan and remove some of the reasons why they deal with these unstable elements inside their own country. As I said, other regional players have strong interest in Pakistan. China has strong interest in Pakistan. Having a stable, secure future Pakistan is in a lot of our interest. They are a nuclear power. We have concerns about their weapons, the security of their weapons. There are many areas in which we believe we should be having very productive dialogue that serves both of our interests and regional interests as well. So this is not a situation where the U.S. is saying, look, it's just us and you. What our approach is to bring, as I said, these regional approaches is to bring all the other interests into this effort. Much as we've done with North Korea and assembling this global effort in North Korea, I think too often we try to distill these challenges down to where it's just the U.S. and some other country, and only between the two of us can we solve it. We have to enlarge the circle of interest and bring others into the effort as well, and that's what we'll be doing with Pakistan as well.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow. We'll have a press briefing at 2 p.m. Thanks.
And there you have Secretary of State Rex Tillerson leaving the podium after a special appearance there in the State Department press briefing, answering a number of questions specifically related to President Trump's announcement last night with a new plan, a new strategy for America's path forward in what is now our country's longest war, the war in Afghanistan. Hi, everyone. I'm Amna Nawaz in New York. We're going to break down what the president talked about last night, what we just learned in that press briefing, and also give you a little bit deeper analysis about what exactly could lay ahead for the U.S. in the region. Joining me in Washington, D.C., ABC News contributor Steve Ganyard and ABC News' own Louis Martinez, who covers the Pentagon for ABC. Thanks so much for both of you for being here. Steve, if we can start with you, you have served on both the military and diplomatic front lines for this country, so you come at this with a very unique perspective. But just give me your take on what the president had to say last night. He sold the plan as a new strategy, a new approach. How new was it to you?
I know there's lots that's new and there's lots that isn't new, but more importantly, I think there's lots that we don't know. We don't know a lot of specifics after the president's talk. We do know that he's committed to remaining in Afghanistan, but we don't know how he's going to do that. We don't know if this is a matter of troop levels, if there are going to be changes in rules of engagement. Will it be training more of the Afghanis? Surely there's a plan here, and the military folks will implement that plan, but we really don't know what the specifics are. So it's the unknowns, I think, that are most interesting out of that, other than the fact that we have another president committing us again for an indefinite period in Afghanistan.
And Louis, one of those unknowns could in fact be troop levels. We've heard a little bit from the Secretary of Defense about what that might mean, and we think we'll get more visibility on it in the weeks ahead. But look, for months now, the conversation has been, years even, when are we leaving, when are we leaving? As Steve just pointed out, it doesn't look like we're leaving anytime soon.
No, it's a total reversal. The Obama administration had a plan to draw down to about 1,000 military personnel, kind of like what they call the embassy-size staffing around this time. And they adjusted their plans last year because President Obama wanted to let the next president decide what the course of action would be in Afghanistan. Well, what we're seeing now is they've got 8,400 troops there right now. Potentially at a minimum, let's say at a minimum right now, 4,000 additional troops could be headed there. I'm saying that because we have been led to believe that Secretary Mattis favored sending 3,900 additional troops, enablers, to Afghanistan to help support the Afghan military in its fight against the Taliban. But now it's possible, based on Secretary Mattis's comments today, that he's going to reassess that. He's asked the Joint Staff to come up with new proposals, and once they get that, he might adjust the numbers. And he told reporters traveling with him in Iraq today that it may not be the number that you've heard, which is this 3,900 to 4,000 number, which may mean it could be less, it could be more.
And we don't know yet. But Steve, talk to me a little bit about that number. And Louis, feel free to jump in on this because obviously you know more about this than most anyone here. What kind of difference would troop levels make at this point? We're talking about a 16-year war. We've had surges before. We've had pulled back before. What is the difference? What would it take to do, as Secretary Tillerson said, to actually turn the tide in Afghanistan?
As you point out, we've been at any number we pick is a number we've been at before, and it may not have made a difference. I think it's going to be a question of what percentage of those troops will go to what tasks. So if we're going to increase the number of U.S. troops that train, say, Afghan Special Operations Forces, or the number of troops that will be able to call in airstrikes, that's a change in tactics. That's a change in operational strategy. So it's always interesting, like, let's give us a number because a number allows us to quantify what change might look like. But I think until we see how those numbers are going to be used and what the real changes in the way that our troops will be operating in Afghanistan will be, to include potentially, as Martha alluded to in her question, do we go after terrorists in the FATA, in the federally administered tribal areas, the ungoverned areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where traditionally the Taliban has used that as a refuge, the Haqqani network in particular there and in Quetta. So the question is, are we allowed to go after that? Is the president saying that we can strike terrorists in another country's sovereign territory without their permission? There are people who say that's a good idea, and there are people who say that's a bad idea.
But Steve, to be clear now, you're talking about ground troops, right? Because that would be the difference. For years, the U.S. has been carrying out drone strikes in that exact same tribal region.
Yes, but remember that one of the things that's not said is there's always somebody picking those targets on the ground. So, are they CIA? Are they ISIS? The Pakistani intelligence service. Whose are they, and who's picking out those targets on the ground? So maybe they're more U.S. Special Operations Forces. Maybe they work more in the FATA. Maybe they pressure the Haqqani network. Maybe that there are things even within Pakistan itself. We'll see, but certainly something has to change. And one of the things we heard from Secretary Tillerson and the President last night is that the relationship with Pakistan will change. This is new. This is something that's been batted around under the presidencies both of President Bush and President Obama, but neither decided that it was worth taking up the fight, essentially, with Pakistan, because it means taking sides in the dispute between Pakistan and India. So this is the first time the U.S. has looked at Afghanistan in a regional context, which means that we take sides and we favor India at the expense of Pakistan, but we also look at this in terms of what Russia's doing. We also look in terms of China and what China's doing, in not only in Afghanistan, but how they're threatening their neighbors in India. So this is really interesting from a geostrategic prospect, and it means that the U.S. is no longer just focused on the tactical and the local within Afghanistan.
Louis, what's your take on that sort of larger regional context around which this is now going to be fought moving forward?
No, Steve's totally right. I mean, this is what we've heard from Defense Secretary Mattis now for weeks, if not months, that, the narrow focus on Afghanistan. The Obama administration talked about AFPAC, that's short for Afghanistan and Pakistan. We heard Mattis talk about, no, let's bring in everybody else. This is a broader issue. This is a regional issue. And I think this is what differentiates this plan right now from previous options that we've heard before. But at the same time, it incorporates some, as Steve said earlier, stuff that is old, something that is new, and stuff that is unclear. One of the things that I think that we really have to talk about is what are these U.S. troops doing in Afghanistan? I think there's a misperception right now that these are U.S. troops that are going to go straight into combat in Afghanistan. That was the case when we had 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan that were ordered there by President Obama in 2009. That was what they were doing. They were engaging in direct combat with the Taliban. That mission's evolved. It's no longer that. It's now a training mission. That's what happened after 2014. So what does that mean? It means that U.S. troops, for the most part, most of those almost 10,000 troops that we had there for a good while, they stayed on their bases. They were there advising the senior level commanders. They were advising things that take time, such as building air support, building logistic networks so that the Afghan military could support themselves. It was actually a very small number of American troops that were going out there in combat situations, typically special operations forces accompanying Afghan commandos. That evolved, and the security situation deteriorated in Afghanistan. That's why President Obama enabled further authorities so that they could call in new airstrikes, because for a time, because that training mission had changed, the only way that American forces or Afghan forces could call in airstrikes was if they were under attack. So President Obama loosened those as the fight in eastern Afghanistan worsened against ISIS, the ISIS affiliate there. And also last summer, he enabled further airstrike opportunities against the Taliban. So what are the additional numbers going to do? It's apples and oranges, because the mission of the U.S. forces back during their peak of 100,000 is much different than the situation today. So I think what you're doing is you're enhancing the mission with the additional troops, and you're providing those Afghan forces with the resources that they need so they can continue to fight themselves. And I think that's where you see a major continuation with the Obama administration. The focus is not going to be, apparently, on U.S. troops, the majority of U.S. troops engaging in direct combat with the Taliban or with ISIS-Khorasan. They are the ones who are continuing to do that. We're just going to magnify that opportunity for them with additional firepower from the sky and just an additional logistics and intelligence support. That's my take on it right now.
But at the same time, and a little bit of historical context is necessary here, right? Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires for a reason. And when you look at what the Taliban statement in response to President Trump's announcement was, not surprisingly, they basically said, we're here, we're going to keep fighting. They have one mission, which is to get the U.S. and U.S. troops out. They're able to recruit on that, to get more volunteers. They're going, for every one terrorist that we kill, there may be another one that pops up there. So even though President Trump said, we are not nation building, we are killing terrorists, doesn't it take more to actually secure the future of Afghanistan?
There's no doubt about it. What's happening in Afghanistan with the Trump strategy, the way I interpret it is that they are in this for the long game. This is no longer the timetables that were set by the Obama administration. Let's remember why there were those timetables to begin with. They were to have the Afghan government support itself, get strong enough, and build up its military so that they can provide security. There is the thinking that if we stay there too long fighting for them on their behalf, that they're never going to take up that security. Well, that transition happened, and they've suffered significant losses. I think it's like 7,000 Afghan soldiers died last year. We keep talking about the 2,200 American fatalities in Afghanistan over 16 years. In the last 2 years, there have been 12,000 Afghan soldiers that have died as they have taken on that responsibility. Significant challenges for them. And so you're right. I mean, those timetables played to the advantage of the Taliban, and the U.S. may now be in the long game, but they've been in this for the long game for a long time, and it's going to be a test of wills here to see how long the United States is really planning on staying in Afghanistan.
So, Steve, we've heard again and again about the integrated approach, right? That they want that to be something new, about conditional support. In other words, you guys have to make stuff happen before you get anything from us, from the U.S. How does that play out in the region now, particularly with some of the naming and shaming that's going on from the administration to some of the regional players and to Pakistan in particular? What does the U.S. do to make sure that everyone is on the same page?
I don't think the U.S. will get everybody on the same page ever. Not in a region like this, with with hundreds of different of competing incentives and the tribalism that exists. So I think the best the U.S. can do is do what Secretary Tillerson alluded to, and that is get the Taliban to the negotiating table. Now, people go, well, they'll never negotiate. Everybody's going to negotiate sometime. If the Taliban are looking to consolidate power within Afghanistan, at some point they can be pounded into coming to the table. Now, whether that is sort of a Vietnam peace with honor, where we can get out of there, that's one thing. But again, going back to your historical analogy, I like history, I like British history too, but to compare the U.S., who came into Afghanistan because of the threat posed by al-Qaeda, who was given a haven in southern Afghanistan, is very different from the imperial mission that the British had throughout the 1800s. So we need to be careful, I think, about the analogy there. We're there to kill terrorists, but we figured out that terrorism also grows when you have weak institutions, when you have a country that really is not a country, that is a collection of tribes. And so the U.S. has this very difficult challenge. How long do we stay there if all we're going to do is kill terrorists? Because, well, that's fine, because we'll be able to have bases there and we'll be able to surround the bases. But at some point, if the civil society that we had hoped would grow in Afghanistan, and that we've spent so many lives and billions of dollars trying to grow, if that fails, then what are we left with? Just some bases that we launch from, where terrorists are still able to find safe haven. This is why this is not, this has been a Republican and a Democratic problem, and you'll find people with differing views within each party, and so there's no clear answers to this. This is not an easy question, but the one thing that I think does give us hope is that we're going to address it in a far more regional context. As you say, there are things that we can do with Pakistan. We give them a lot of money. For years, they've taken billions of dollars on one hand, and on the other, they've assisted in the killing of U.S. service personnel. So to call them to task and say, you can either take our money or you can try to kill U.S. service personnel, but you're not going to do both. And also the threat overhanging with India. If they want us to side with India and to isolate them in the world, that will put them in a very tentative position, which they have an existential, deathly fear of. So lots of things that we can do with Pakistan to force them to do more on our behalf.
And lots, as you say, we don't know. We hope to learn in the weeks ahead. And thanks to both of you, Steve Ganyard and Louis Martinez, for joining me today. I appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks to all of you for watching as well. Remember, you can go to abcnews.com anytime for continuing coverage of this story and many others. For now, I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.